The film opens in the backyard of the Matthews family. The youngest daughter Sophie realizes she is dreaming as she sees her father Paul by the pool. Something shatters the glass table and they both look up. Continuing to do what they're doing, a shoe falls from the sky and lands on the pool water. Sophie keeps calling her dad when a body falls in the water and everything around them starts floating up to the sky just before Sophie wakes up. Paul kept asking why he didn't do anything and why he was just standing in her dreams. Janet tries to casually make Paul drop the topic not to stress Sophie and make her feel guilty about her dreams anymore. Paul is a mild-mannered biology professor, married to Janet, and in addition to Sophie, they have an older daughter, Hannah. At the university where he teaches, in the middle of giving a lecture he spots two students gossiping. He then goes to a restaurant to meet with a former colleague, Sheila. On his way in, the receptionist hesitated if she knew him or not. She tells him she must have had a déjà vu or something. At the restaurant with Sheila, Paul talks with her about giving him credit for an article she is writing based on a subject that he wanted to write a book about years ago. She tries to tell him that talking about something and doing it are two different things. He tells her about a book he wrote, and when she asks if he got a publisher, he confesses that he didn't write one, he is just planning on doing so. He even tries to record their conversation, as Janet asked him, to get her to admit that he deserves credit. But he gets nothing. She even tells him that there's nothing wrong with just being a professor. Disappointed, Paul lies to Janet saying he didn't record their conversation, thinking it's unethical. Paul and Janet go to a play. Paul was receiving weird looks from strangers. As Paul and Janet were leaving, they ran into an ex-girlfriend of his named Claire. She asked Paul when he got married, and Janet answered 15 years ago. Janet was uncomfortable with the way Paul was reacting to seeing Claire as he was stuttering and blushing. Claire claims that Paul has been appearing in dreams of hers lately, but she assures the couple that the dreams aren't sexual. Paul is seen in Claire's dream, just strolling by while she is holding a friend in a car accident. She asks Paul for his number, which he gave her with no hesitation. She later meets with Paul privately to ask if she can write about the dreams she has been having with him, after explaining that she works for the New Inquiry magazine online and that it's just very brand for what she does. For a moment he thought she was going to ask him to write about his book, not him appearing in her dreams, but he agreed anyway as long as she doesn't portray him as the loser in her dream. While he's walking to class, Paul hears students whispering about having the same dream where Paul is involved. At home, Paul gets a call from Richard and he tells him one night at one of his dinner parties, friends gathered there all claim to be seeing Paul reappearing in their dreams. Paul faints right there without even hanging up the phone. Soon, more people claim to be seeing Paul reappearing in their dreams. He soon gets messages from people on Facebook, since Claire attached a link to his profile in her article, and hundreds of other people contact Paul and say they are dreaming about him. He even found someone who says they will interview him. Janet tells him to cool it down, but he goes ahead and gets the interview. When Paul got to his classroom, all his students started to clap for him. He asks his students if they have dreamt about him, and they all say yes. However, Paul is disappointed to learn he is nothing more than an observer passing through other weird events. Janet keeps getting questions about Paul at her workplace. She asks a guy to join them for a project that they are working on, just to bounce ideas. At home, Paul informs Janet that they got invited over to one of Richard's dinner parties. Paul later asks Janet if she dreams of him, and she says no. He asks what kind of dream she would like to have of him, and she says she would like to see Paul save her from a situation while wearing an oversized suit like David Byrne of Talking Heads, or he can just come on a horse naked. Paul's picked the first one. At night, a mentally ill man breaks into the Matthews home and threatens to kill Paul. After the police take care of the man, they tell him he needs more security since he is becoming famous and that these kinds of violent acts are expected to happen. At the university, Brett tried to convince Paul that people were seeing him in their dreams because he was all over the news and on the internet, not because he was special. Paul goes to sign with a PR firm named Thoughts, since he is now something of a well-known public figure. He meets 3 members of a team, Trent, Mary, and Molly. Molly tells him that she has been having dreams about him every night very shyly. Trent tries to get Paul to sign up as a spokesperson for Sprite, but Paul is more interested in using the exposure to get his book published. Molly later approaches Paul and invites him to get a drink. After Paul mistakenly assumes Janet is with another man, Chris, who she's been working on the new project with. He accepts Molly's invitation. She admits to him that her dreams about him involve them having passionate sex. While Paul seems initially uncomfortable at the idea, he joins Molly back at her apartment to recreate the dream. It gets ruined when Paul farts twice and prematurely ejaculates, forcing him to leave in humiliation. Back at home, Paul is angered to discover that Sheila published her article without giving him credit. Sophie later dreams of her dad stomping into her room while wearing a creepy smile, which frightens her. Downstairs she finds him screaming at a newspaper that's written about Sheila and runs back to bed. Later, some of Paul's students experience horrifying nightmares of him attacking, raping or murdering them, which causes them not to come to class. Brett has a talk with Paul at his office and tells him they need to pause the semester, and they end up fighting about it. Everybody else starts to have nightmares involving Paul. He and Janet go to Richard and Carlotta's home for the dinner party they got invited to, but Carlotta couldn't even try to hide that she was uncomfortable. Once she loses it and leaves the dinner table, that causes Richard to send Paul and Janet away, telling them that Carlotta had nightmares about Paul and that they can't have them at their house for the night. A psychiatrist tries to help Paul to come to peace with the students, but they are still terrified of him. One of them spray paints "loser" on his car, which causes him to have an outburst while the students are recording him and calling him names. That only makes people turn on him more though. He is eventually put on an extended leave. He tells his family that he will finally have the time to write his book. Chris tells Janet that she can't work on the project with them just until the whole scandal situation with Paul blows over. Sophie tells Paul that kids at her school call him Freddy Krueger. She tells him a kid called Julian told her that he saw Paul tie him up, cut all his toes, and eat them. He tries to explain to her that he has nothing to do with other people's dreams. In bed, Janet mentions to him about texts from Molly. He was then on a conference call with Trent, Molly, and Mary. They tell him that they will need to change strategies and that he can share his experience of being cancelled and pivot that into something else. He might even still make it in France since they love him there. He tells them he hates their idea and if he can do some kind of charity job. Paul later goes to a diner where he is told that his presence is making people uncomfortable. Another patron tries to get Paul to leave by spitting on his food, which leads to a fight after Paul throws the plate at him and gets a black eye and bloody nose. Janet comes to get him and tells him to make a public statement apologizing, but he refuses to listen and angrily dismisses it. The rest of Paul's family also suffers as a result of the nightmares. Janet nearly loses her job due to her marriage to him, and Sophie is getting picked on at school. Paul later appears to find himself being chased down the street by someone with a crossbow, shooting him twice with arrows. The man approaches him, revealed to be a dream version of Paul in one of his nightmares. He is also told by Sophie's teacher Kayla that he cannot attend Sophie's upcoming play because others have requested that he not be there. This causes Paul to make an apology video saying that he gets to experience it and that the man in the dreams is not him, and he asks people to understand that he's one of them. But because he paints himself as the victim, Janet and the girls view it as pathetic and self-pitying. He goes over to Brett to stay and he leads him to his basement to sleep over, saying his wife is not okay with him staying with them. In the middle of the night, he was bothered by a fluorescent light that wouldn't just turn off. Paul later goes to Sophie's school to sneak into the play. Kayla catches him and tries to keep him out, but after a struggle, Paul slams the door on her, causing Kayla's pinky finger to be severed. She started screaming and showing people that he had attacked her. Now convinced Paul is dangerous, the other parents forcibly remove him from the school, while his wife and daughters watch in horror and shame, while he's still telling them that it was only an accident. In the aftermath, Paul divorces Janet and finds a new place to live, and he goes and checks it out with his daughters. He asks them about Chris and if he still shows up at the house, and they tell if they don't know. Eventually, nobody dreams of Paul anymore, but he is credited for the development of dream traveling. Tech billionaire Brian Berg developed a device that allows people to travel into anybody else's dreams called the Notio, but a group of influencers are using it for advertising in other people's dreams. People also believe Paul actively chose to terrorize others in their dreams. Sophie wants her father back home and Hannah is still too embarrassed. He and Janet share an emotional hug when he goes to say goodbye before he leaves for France. He asks her if she sometimes sees him in her dreams. It is hinted that they still love each other. Paul was in his bed trying the dream travel tools in a dream when he appeared in a weird dream with people from the advertising. Paul goes back to Trent to help him fix his image. They made him do an advertisement he didn't want to do, but he made a deal with them about his book, so he finally agreed. He wrote an autobiography in France that he called Dream Scenario, only for them to rewrite it as I Am Your Nightmare, in French. He also noticed that the page was thin but didn't complain, assuming that it must have gotten shorter in translation. The book is published smaller than Paul had hoped, and it doesn't sell very well. He does a tour in France, and during a signing at the basement, a light falls from the ceiling and hits him on the head, leaving him bleeding. Paul buys the dream traveling device, the Norio, while the instructor guides them by saying they need to choose someone who would welcome them in their dreams, while Paul is lying on the floor attempting to get into Hyuntae's dream. He finds himself in the oversized suit she wants, going to save her from being burned to death. He pulls her out of the fire and they walk home holding hands. They then share a romantic moment, at last Paul whispering to Janet that he wishes this was real. He then floats to the sky as everything else around them does too, and Janet begins to wake up. With that, the movie ends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.